Today I want to tell you about a very interesting case. This is the case of a 25-year-old young man who worked in the gay adult film industry, right? And on Halloween weekend in 1990, part of his body was found in a dumpster in the city of Santa Monica, California. This case becomes much more interesting because it remained unsolved for over 30 years, and thanks to a documentary, it was finally resolved. I want to note there's little information on this case. Yes, we were searching for old articles. That's why we decided to base everything you're going to hear today in this video on articles from that time and also on a podcast called Dinner Partners. They did some research with people who knew Billy. It's very interesting and has 3 episodes about this story, but let's start at the beginning. We're going back to October 29, 1990. On that date, it was a Monday. A man who was looking for cans, probably a homeless person. The news doesn't make it very clear who this person was, but someone who was looking for cans to recycle. In a dumpster, he started rummaging. This garbage container was located in an alley near Santa Monica Boulevard in the city of Santa Monica, California. This man saw what looked like a head in a bag. Yes, so he called the police. Imagine finding a head in a bag in a dumpster. The first thing you should do is call the police, as it might be a homicide. Several officers and also the detective who was in charge of the Hollywood Police Department's homicide division showed up at the scene. One of the officers who was off duty at the time was called in because they had this case, but it was his day off, so he went dressed in civilian clothes. He saw that the dumpster was outside an auto repair shop. The first thing they did was talk to the owner of the shop to inform him of what they had found, and then this officer for some reason got into the dumpster. We'll discuss this part later, but for now, let's stick with that. He got into the dumpster. This police officer claimed that he saw that the bag had almost no blood on it and that the head had its eyes open and that they were a very bright blue color. He said he had never seen that intensity in another person's eye color. He also mentioned that the hair was blonde, almost white, and that the head was clean, meaning it didn't look like a severed head, it looked like a mannequin. When he saw this, he quickly got out of the dumpster because he didn't want to contaminate the scene. Still, I think he already contaminated the scene by entering the dumpster, and when the forensic experts and evidence collectors arrived, they analyzed the entire dumpster and found another bag that contained the man's feet, and the other parts of the body were never found, meaning only the feet and the head. The other thing that was also found was a t-shirt that was later confirmed to belong to the victim, which was the same one he wore a day before when he was last seen. And we're talking about Billy Newton. Yes, his real name was William Newton. He was known as Billy Newton, and we're going to talk about him right now. As I said, initially it wasn't known who it was until the disappearance of Billy Newton was reported in early November 1990. He was 25 years old, and this is what led the investigators to confirm that the body found was that of this young man. Billy, whose real name was William Newton, had a rather peculiar life. He had made XXX movies, and despite what the climate was like in the 90s, he had a family that loved and supported him. And I'm talking about the context of that time because those were some of the most difficult years for the gay community. There was still a lot of rejection in the United States. Also, crimes against gay people were often not taken very seriously, and society didn't see them as victims, but rather as people who deserved what happened to them. That was the general way of thinking. In 1990, it was also the time when hundreds of thousands of people died from the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Billy was in that environment, but with the privilege of having a family that loved him regardless of his sexuality, even when he made XXX videos. Billy was born in Wisconsin, and in the early 80s, he moved to California with his family, and since around 1984, his home was in Los Angeles until the day he died. And the investigation started that very same day. It didn't take long for people to learn that on the previous night, Sunday, October 28, 1990, Billy had been seen at a nightclub called Rage Nightclub, which was very popular in West Hollywood, California. This nightclub was open for 37 years until it closed in 2020. But this place, according to what's said in this podcast, and also by many people who lived during that time, was considered an icon of the gay nightlife in California and West Hollywood. Something else that should be clarified is that for people who have never been to California and for people who aren't gay, West Hollywood is like a very gay city. Even today in Los Angeles, yes, that's super important to clarify. Although there were witnesses who saw Billy that Sunday night, or rather that Sunday afternoon, there wasn't much information. They didn't know if he ended the night with someone or if he went back to his apartment alone. Billy had a boyfriend named Mark, who used the stage name David Ray, who was the one that helped him get into the XXX video industry and with whom he also produced at least 8 movies together, something that should be mentioned because I said that Mark was the real name of the boyfriend, but he used the stage name David Ray. Billy also had a stage name because he was an actor in, let's say, XXX movies. So he used the name Billy London and sometimes used the name Billy Houston when he did these movies. So in many places, including documentaries and articles that talk about Billy Newton refer to him as Billy London, which was his stage name, but we are going to keep using his real name. Young, good scheme that creates a bond, and I recommend that. He was a XXX movie director and had met Billy in West Hollywood's gay nightlife. They started a relationship and began working together. Later, they would open a company called London Ray Productions. Billy Newton worked behind the camera. He was also an actor, which was when he used the name Billy London, and he even became the director of some movies. According to the investigation, in one of the movies they had filmed just 4 days before the body was found, Billy said he had become interested in one of the actors hired for that movie. First, they investigated this actor, the one they said Billy was hooked on. I don't know if he was in love, but he was kind of hooked. We don't know his name. And we also have to say that he was ruled out. There was nothing to indicate that he was the culprit, and apparently he had an alibi that fit perfectly. Now there was David Ray, who was the official partner, and maybe even though they were obviously in an open relationship, apparently they had limits when it came to falling in love with others. It could have been the boyfriend if we analyze that angle of the case. And in a little while we're going to talk about the confirmed timeline where we go over the days that led up to the discovery of the body. But let's talk about the autopsy, because this ends up being very interesting. As we know, only the head was found and the feet were also found, and the t-shirt we had mentioned. The autopsy was also able to determine 3 things. First, that there were signs of strangulation. They determined this because there were marks that had been found on the neck. Second, there was a blow with a blunt object to the back of the head. And third, the face was clean. There wasn't a single bruise on the face. According to the authorities, this opened up several possible theories. For example, that the person may not have been attacked. Because in similar cases, where there was a terrible attack, you can see a lot of marks on the face. But Billy was clean. There wasn't a single bruise. That could mean that Billy might have lost consciousness from the blow to the head, and then the killer strangled him just enough to make sure he had finished him off. And we say lightly, porque Because normally in strangulations, in cases of strangulation, you usually see bruising or bleeding in the eyes, but Billy didn't have any of that. Now, what stands out in this case is that the torso was never found. This too. It left open a possibility. Maybe the major damage was on the body. Maybe they would be able to find DNA somewhere on the body. But that the killer had left the head in the trash. It meant that possibly he wanted the victim to be identified. But he needed to hide the rest, because probably the answer to the crime was there. All of this even led to the theory that maybe Billy consumed something that he was given. This person felt sick, lost consciousness, and the killer, not knowing how to react, and faced with the possibility of a charge that could send him to prison, he decided to kill Billy and get rid of the body. This obviously made the case even more complicated, because if it was some random person that Billy met the night before. And we also have to say that we're talking about a time when evidence was hard to come by. There were almost no security cameras, no GPS, no cell phones. There also wasn't much technology like we have now, because a similar case today would be solved in days. But in this story, we're talking about more than 30 years without anyone responsible being identified. And that's where the case ended, right? The authorities and Billy's family tried to keep the story alive. But in the end, there was nothing new. We found Billy's obituary from November 14, 1990, where they briefly talk about the victim. There they say his name is William Newton, born on July 26, 1965, and that he had died on October 28, 1990 in West Hollywood. I mean, not that he was born in Wisconsin. He died in West Hollywood? They don't mention the cause of death or how it happened. That's normal. Usually obituaries don't say how the person died. They do mention the parents, and also his sister named Michelle Harriman, by the way. Billy's father even stated that his son was about to move to Las Vegas, to live with his sister and also with his mother, to get away from life in Los Angeles for a while. And at the end of this obituary it says the following: the funeral is scheduled for a future date. Which perhaps had to do with the investigation, as of November 14th, which was when this obituary was published. Which was 2 weeks after the crime. They still hadn't released the body parts that were found. Months went by. Exactly 8 months since the murder, when a person called the authorities to report what they had seen. He is considered the first credible witness in the Billy Newton case. According to their statement, he didn't call until 8 months after Billy's murder because he had seen something on the news. With that, he began piecing things together. At the time, he mentioned that he had found out about Billy's death. But something else had happened 8 months later that made him call the authorities again. The witness's name was Ron Wheeler, and his story was as follows. He lived just steps away from the Rage nightclub, where Billy had been seen for the last time, and we're going to talk about this situation now. And this man named Ron Wheeler had a roommate named Mark Sage, who was also an adult film actor. Mark had told Ron that he wanted to go that Sunday afternoon, October 28, 1990, to that nightclub called Rage for a happy hour, and that some of his friends were going to be there. Ron and Mark went to this bar, and there, according to Ron, the witness met Billy for the first time. He already knew of him, because Billy was known for the movies he had made, but it was the first time he had spoken with him. Ron said that at one point he went to the bar to order a drink, and he saw that a very handsome man was there at the bar of the Rage nightclub. Ron said he found him very attractive. Ron ordered his drink and stayed talking with this man. This man told him that he was visiting the city, that he wasn't from West Hollywood, and he wasn't from Los Angeles, that he was from somewhere else. And he asked him if every night that place was so empty, because at that time, during happy hour, which often happens in the afternoon, I have to say, there still weren't many people in that nightclub. Ron told him that. A little later, the place would be full, like every Sunday. and that he and his friend were going to come back at that time, hoping they could find him again. A little later, Ron came back with his group of friends. He told several of them that he had talked to the man at the bar. He pointed him out. He also told them that he found him very attractive, to which several of his friends agreed that the man was handsome. A few minutes later, Ron saw that Billy went to get a drink. Billy Newton, Billy London. He started talking to the same man, and after getting his drink, he grabbed one of the stools and stayed talking with this man at the bar. Ron stated that 15 minutes later, he saw that Billy and this man left the bar together, that Billy didn't say goodbye to anyone, and that Ron got a little jealous. Because he wanted to be with the man at the bar, because he had seen him first. And that's why he remembers very well this whole situation, that he saw Billy, that Billy left with this man who was very handsome, and that many in the group. They saw this man at the bar. On Halloween night, October 30th, there was a huge party in the Boys Town neighborhood in Los Angeles, which is the gay neighborhood where all these nightclubs are. Ron mentioned that he was getting ready to go out that night. That's when his roommate, Mark, told him that Billy had been found dead, and that only his head and feet were found in the dumpster. That's when he realized that maybe the man he had seen with Billy a few nights before could have been the one who hurt him. In fact, he had gone back to the same bar. He talked to the bartender and they both decided to contact the police to report this. But they didn't have anything else. They didn't have a name or exactly where the man was from. They only knew he was a visitor and they had a description of what he looked like. They mentioned that he was a man with blonde hair, with glasses, quite attractive, and with a good physique. It was officially recorded by the police that Billy was last seen in this bar, so possibly this man could be involved, or at least he had to be questioned to find out if he had seen anything else, because maybe he'd been with Billy, and then Billy left the hotel where the man was staying, assuming he was in a hotel because he was just visiting. Something might have happened to him involving someone else. Now let's go to the interesting part of this story. On July 22, 1991, 8 months after this situation, Ron Wheeler, the witness, called the police again. And do you know why he called? 8 months later. Because on that date, all the media outlets were talking about the capture of Jeffrey Dahmer. Ron Wheeler claimed. He claimed that the man he had seen on the night of October 28, 1990, leaving the rage bar with Billy, it was Jeffrey Dahmer. He was 100% sure of this, and he said that if it really wasn't Jeffrey Dahmer, it was his double. Now, Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes mostly happened in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and this is when the stories of both men start to intertwine, if you remember. Billy was born in Wisconsin, and he spent much of his childhood and early adult years in the city of Eau Claire. But although this place is almost 4 hours from Milwaukee because Jeffrey Dahmer lived in Milwaukee, there was a possibility that both men could have met at some point. Even though it was 4 hours away, Milwaukee was a very well-known city, and it could have happened. Billy even made trips to Milwaukee. The way Jeffrey killed was also similar. He dismembered the bodies, and it was also very similar to the murder of Stephen Tuomi, who was the man Jeffrey met at a bar called Club 219, and then later, in a room at the Ambassador Hotel, he killed him. The physical description was also similar, and Ron was sure. Ron Wheeler, the witness, was sure that Jeffrey Dahmer was the man last seen with Billy. He was sure because he talked to him, because he was interested in being with him, and because he got jealous when he saw Billy leave the bar with this man. It was known that Jeffrey used to take trips. He even went to Miami. In fact, we worked on a case, I can't remember which one, but we talked about Jeffrey Dahmer being in Miami. It's also recorded that he traveled to Chicago and Ohio, and during these trips he would go to gay bars. But we have to say that there are no official records of a trip by Jeffrey Dahmer to California in October 1990. Ron said he called 911, and even though they took his statement, they never called him back. and he never heard anything about it again. By 1994, Ron found out that they were reopening the investigation into the Billy Newton case, and that finally they were going to interview Jeffrey Dahmer about his statement that he was a witness who had seen him with Billy at that nightclub called Rage. But before they could do it, Jeffrey was attacked in prison on November 28 of that year. And he died at 34 years old, and that's where this matter ended. There were many possibilities that Jeffrey could have been Billy's killer, although many believe that. Jeffrey only had Black, Latino, or Asian victims. The truth was that at least 4 or 5 of his victims were white, and one of them was even blonde like Billy. And the other thing is that Jeffrey's last victim before Billy's case was on September 24, 1990. That was David Thomas. For more than 5 months, there were no other confirmed victims, which gives a possible window for Jeffrey to have traveled to California for Halloween, which is also one of the biggest gay parties in West Hollywood, which meant that it could have been something that happened, but there is no real evidence other than these testimonies. Something important to mention is that Jeffrey's mother lived in California at that time. This created a connection with the place where Billy's murder happened, and even though they hadn't spoken in the last 5 years, according to Jeffrey Dahmer, it's confirmed that Jeffrey started talking to his mother between the end of 1990 and the beginning of 1991. That was when Billy's murder happened. I want to talk about another possibility that was also considered. This has a lot to do with the context of that time as well. In the United States, since 1920, a legal defense was created that helped a lot of people get away with murder. In English, this legal defense was called homosexual panic, or in Spanish, pánico homosexual. Although officially it began to be used in 1920. By 1990, many cases of murders of gay people, they tried to justify themselves with this legal concept. For example, a straight man, he felt panic because a gay man called him handsome and he killed him, justifying it with the gay panic defense. There were other cases too. It might have been Billy's. There were also cases of heterosexual men who had relationships with other men and suddenly went crazy and killed the gay man they were involved with. Many times to avoid rumors, but always justifying themselves with the gay panic defense. And if we take into account that in the 90s there was a lot of talk about HIV, then the number of murder cases using this type of defense was much higher in 1990. In the following years, some notable cases emerged. One of them was James Zappalorti's case in 1995. Also, there was the Jenny Jones show case, which is very well known because it involved a broadcast of a television program where a man confessed his love to a straight friend. After this program, because he felt humiliated, this straight man ended up killing his gay friend. And in 1998, there's the case of Matthew Shepard, which is also very interesting. I think we can cover these cases if you want. Let me know in the comments if you'd like us to cover them on the channel in the future. Alright, let's go to the confirmed timeline of Billy Newton's case. On Thursday, October 25th, 1994, days before the discovery of the body, or rather, the body parts, Billy had worked with his boyfriend on a movie called In the Grip of Passion, in which Billy helped with makeup and also acted. It was in this movie that he had worked with the other actor, whom Billy said he felt very attracted to. As we said, this actor was ruled out, and we have to say that nowadays, he is no longer alive, but we don't have details about this. It's simply known that this actor has already passed away the next day, Friday, October 26, 1990. Billy acted in other scenes for the movie Fantasy Images, which was a movie made by a production company. Different, not the boyfriends. He had been hired for another scene in the same movie that was going to be filmed the following week. But obviously Billy would be killed in the following days, according to people who worked, or rather, who used to work, on this movie. It was a whole afternoon of filming that ended at midnight. And Billy, at 12:35 after midnight, was already in his apartment. One of the employees from this movie took him to his apartment. Saturday, October 27th, 1990. And this was one day before the incident at the Rage nightclub and 2 days before the body was found. Billy again filmed a scene, but this time for the movie he was making with his boyfriend David Ray. After finishing work at around 9:30 p.m., David and Billy went to have dinner at a restaurant called the Yukon Mining Company, which no longer exists today. But at that time, it was very famous. It was open 24 hours and was located at 7328 Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood. And today, it's a branch of Wells Fargo Bank. I also want to say that this restaurant was very well known because it served breakfast all day long. Not just in the morning, it was one of those diners that are very well known or very popular in the United States where you can eat dishes or a breakfast menu. 24 hours? After dinner, they went to a bar for a very short time just to say hi to some friends, and then by midnight, David took Billy to his apartment. And it's important to mention that Billy had 2 roommates who were a couple, and for 2 months he had been sleeping in the living room on a couch, because if you remember, he was about to move to Las Vegas with his sister. Sunday, October 28, 1990 was the last day that several people saw Billy, including his boyfriend David Ray. At 8:30 a.m. it was recorded that Billy spoke on the phone with his sister Michelle, because Billy and his mom were moving to Las Vegas so they could all live together. This move was scheduled for the next few days, and if it wasn't obvious, Billy's parents were separated. Yes, they didn't live in the same city. I think the father still lived in Wisconsin, and the mother was moving to Las Vegas with the sister and with Billy. The sister said that the call she had with Billy was recorded. They were debating whether it was better to take a bus or a plane to go to Las Vegas. After hanging up the call, Billy made 2 calls to a bus company, which meant that he finally decided to buy tickets with this company. After this, the second roommate arrived at the apartment. Apparently, before being with David Ray, Billy had been in a relationship with his roommates. I think this is called a throuple, when there are 3 people in a relationship. But at the time of Billy's murder, they were just friends. And Billy was sleeping on the couch because he was about to move to Las Vegas. And I also understand that the apartment had only 1 bedroom. So the couple lived in the bedroom while Billy slept on the couch in the living room. This apartment was also in Beverly Hills, but just steps from West Hollywood. He had told his roommates that he was going to take a shower and then he would walk to a video store called Video West, which was 6 blocks from the apartment at 805 Larrabee Street, and this was to rent a movie. At 11 a.m., Billy left on his way to the video store, and strangely, the roommate and her boyfriend told the police that they also left on their way to a picnic from a church, which was strange because apparently these guys weren't religious, and it wasn't a common activity for gay men at that time when there was so much discrimination, especially with the church, before they parted ways. They had arranged to meet around 4 p.m. so they could all go together to the happy hour at Rage nightclub. That's something the police investigated. They checked the Video West records. According to the investigation, the employees didn't see Billy that morning, and they didn't have a rental record under his name either, with them saying they went to a church picnic and then not finding any record of Billy at the video store. Their statements were quite suspicious. It didn't make sense. Now, why would they lie? Because Billy didn't disappear at that time. It wasn't that morning when he disappeared. It was after he went to the nightclub, where there were more witnesses who claimed they saw him. We can also speculate that the roommates didn't lie, and it was Billy who told them all that and changed his plans, or he didn't want to tell them the real plan, which might have been to visit someone. Billy arrived at Rage after 2:30 p.m. In fact, there's even talk of that it was between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m. Sorry, 3 p.m. During that half hour, that's when several witnesses saw him. And this matches the statement of Ron Wheeler, the witness, who said he saw Billy and a man who looked incredibly similar to Jeffrey Dahmer at this place. The authorities later found out that the bartender at that nightclub was starting a relationship with Billy. According to his statement, the bartender said that Billy asked him to talk that Sunday afternoon. Billy also told him that he was not in a good mood, to which the bartender he replied that he was busy hanging decorations for the Halloween event that was going to take place a few days later. I don't know if that was clear. Yes, Billy arrives at the bar at 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon. He approaches the bartender. They were starting something, I don't know, a relationship. Billy was angry. He was not in a good mood. He asked to talk. It seems like they had a fight, and the bartender didn't want to talk to him. That was the situation. That's what the police said about the investigation. The bartender said that Billy sat at the bar completely alone. He had a few drinks, and around 5 p.m. he left the place. He didn't mention the man who looked like Jeffrey Dahmer, which is strange. But we also have to say that we don't know if this bartender is the same one mentioned by the witness named Ron Wheeler. That's what we don't know at this point. The other thing that's also strange is that the bartender said that Billy stayed seated since he arrived until he left at 5, so about 3 hours, at the bar doing nothing. And this is strange because in 1990 there were no cell phones. What was Billy doing alone, having drinks, without talking to anyone at all? There for 3 hours. It's a strange statement too. I think so. And that's what's complicated about this case. Billy was a free man. He had multiple relationships, whether you judge his lifestyle or not. He was a XXX actor. He had intimate relationships with many people and also personal relationships with several people. He was a handsome guy. And everyone in this story seems suspicious. The boyfriend who might have been jealous. Also, Billy was about to leave him because he planned to move to Las Vegas. The roommates who gave statements that didn't make sense. The supposed sighting of Jeffrey Dahmer, the other actor with whom he apparently also had something. Now the bartender, according to his statement, said they weren't doing well. I don't know how to say it. They weren't, let's say, having a good relationship. They weren't doing that well, let's say. There was another one too. Bartender, who stated that he never saw Billy that afternoon, but he did see his co-worker hanging up the decorations for Halloween. So all the witnesses in this case don't make sense. One saw Jeffrey Dahmer, another didn't see anyone at the bar. One bartender said Billy was alone, but the other disagreed. That he never saw Billy at the bar. It's like a disaster. Yes, and this could also be because of the way investigations were handled in the 90s. They didn't really pay much attention to the crimes against gay victims. That could be it. A friend of Billy said that Billy had called him from his house that afternoon, and they talked about the trip to Las Vegas, and that Billy was excited, and they also made plans to meet the next day. And that was Billy's last communication. The roommates didn't see him again that night. No one else talked to him. And that was basically the last communication that Billy had with anyone. The next day, his body would be found in a dumpster in a back alley at 7000 Santa Monica Boulevard, where there was also a mechanic shop that no longer exists, and a recording studio called Studio 56, which is still a studio today, but has a different name. It's called 1041 Production Studios. If you go to Google Maps, you can see two huge dumpsters. That's where they found the body. We're not saying they were the same dumpsters because more than 30 years have passed, but it would be the same location. Some witnesses stated that Billy, he did sex work, but many friends very close to Billy assured that this was a lie. That he was an actor for XXX movies, but that he didn't do any other types of jobs. This also led to the investigation being diverted, thinking that it could have been a client. Something else I want to say is that by the end of 1990, it was estimated that in Los Angeles there were 1,000 murders per month. I mean, it was a very dangerous city. And that made everything more complicated because the investigators were in charge of multiple cases at the same time. What's more, the investigator in Billy's case was investigating the murder of a baby. Around that same time, this baby's case was also making headlines all over the news. That's what was known about the case. For decades, there were no breakthroughs. His sister Michelle always tried to keep the case alive, and so did the father, who unfortunately passed away, before knowing who was responsible for his son's death. In February 2021, the detective in charge of the new investigation into Billy Newton made a statement on the Dinner Partners podcast. In episode 63, that Billy's DNA from the body parts that were found was never uploaded to the DNA database that the authorities had at that time in 2021. It was impossible to exhume the body and get more DNA because more than 30 years had passed. We don't know what happened to Billy's body parts, to be honest. We don't know if they buried the body, but most likely they cremated him because they only had the feet and the head. It doesn't make sense otherwise to put these body parts in a coffin and bury it, right? I think so. For a case like this, the most reasonable thing would be to cremate. And if the body, it's cremated, obviously you can't get DNA, even if he was buried, and more than 30 years had already passed. And exhuming a body, there wouldn't be any DNA left. Therefore, if it was ever found, other parts of Billy's body, they couldn't tell if it was his anymore because there was no way to compare with his DNA. Although it could be compared with his family's DNA because the sister, she's still alive, but not automatically just by uploading it to the police database. It wouldn't be known yet if those body parts belong to Billy. I don't know if that's clear. In this interview, the detective also clarified other details. He said that the initial investigators, they explored every possible line of investigation, including the one involving Jeffrey Dahmer. What he said about the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer was that he was a witness, that this guy, Ron Wheeler, was a credible witness. But unfortunately, even though Jeffrey Dahmer's DNA was in the police database, they didn't have any DNA from Billy's crime scene to compare with Jeffrey Dahmer's DNA. Apparently, no trace of DNA could be identified because Billy's body parts were in a dumpster, and the bags where the body parts were torn or open. Something this detective said, which I find interesting to mention, is that the DNA database used by the authorities has such an intense level of protection and bureaucracy that no detective can access it and search for names. Just like that, out of nowhere. First, they have to go through a process of getting documents signed, even by judges, in order to gain access. Just like it's usually done with raids. And the only way to use the system without so much bureaucracy, it's by having DNA from the crime scene that can be uploaded to the system, and that way it gives you the match found. But as we mentioned with the case of Billy, they didn't have any DNA, neither from the victim nor at the crime scene. So it was impossible to be sure if Jeffrey Dahmer was or wasn't the one responsible for the murder. The detective also mentioned that the way evidence was collected and DNA was searched for in 1990, it was done in such a careless way that nowadays, if a detective did the same job as they did with the Billy Newton case, they would be fired because the scene wasn't properly protected. Just imagine that. As we mentioned at the beginning of the story, one of the detectives went into the dumpster and then came out because he wanted to protect the scene. From there, we can already see how they worked on cases back then. Many even. And this is what the detective said in this interview. Many didn't even wear gloves, and they contaminated the whole scene, which is one of the reasons why many cases from the 90s and also before that time can't be solved, because the investigations weren't done in an organized way, cleanly, like they're done nowadays. Let's see how surprisingly this case was solved. We already know the whole story. We know what happened to Billy. We know all the details. We know the Jeffrey Dahmer theory, but we don't know who the real killer was. As we've already discussed, there was nothing to go on to solve Billy London's or Billy Newton's murder. Rachel Mason is a documentary filmmaker. She did documentary work about the LGBT community, and at one point she started hearing a lot about the Billy Newton case. She mentions that when people talked about Billy, he was described as the gay Black Dahlia. Not sure if you know about the Black Dahlia case. It happened in the 1940s. So they connected it a lot with that case. Because both cases were very terrible, they hadn't been solved, and both were actors, or they wanted to work in show business. Rachel, the documentarian, mentioned that she started to see the possibility of releasing a documentary about Billy. She saw that. Having learned about Billy through his family, his friends, and also his poetry, the poetry that Billy used to write. By the way, that was never mentioned in the first reports about the case, which is important because it also shows how intelligent and sensitive Billy was. And all of this, according to the documentarian, made her realize just how loved Billy was and how sensitive he was. The documentary is called My Brother's Killer, or in Spanish, El Asesino de mi Hermano. Rachel in this documentary, I also want to say that Rachel is not the sister. It seems that the sister who appears in this documentary is Michelle. But Rachel simply, called the documentary that way. Although no, she wasn't related to Billy, obviously. Rachel, in this documentary, starts filming in real time, the process of digging deeper into Billy's story. That was exactly when the hosts of this podcast called Dinner Partners. They received an email about a possible lead on who the killer was. By that time, people were no longer talking about Jeffrey Dahmer. This person who was obsessed with Billy's case, the new witness who contacted the podcast, he claimed that he had investigated Billy's case so much that he started connecting the dots, and he was sure that the killer was a man named Daryl Lynn Maiden. This man was homophobic. He hated gays, and he called himself a white supremacist and a Nazi. At that time, he was already in prison. He was serving a life sentence in the Oklahoma penitentiary for the murder of another gay man. So the director of the documentary, along with the detective on the case, the new detective who had been assigned to investigate the case, went to the Oklahoma prison to interview him. And all of this was filmed in the documentary. By that time, the suspect was no longer a man, he had transitioned to a woman. So back in the day, when he proclaimed himself as anti-gay, so to speak, he was actually living a double life. Something that many experts have already brought to light. Many times, homophobia in men is directly related to people who have homosexual tendencies and try to cover it up by showing hatred. There are studies that have been done, like the one from the University of Georgia in 1996, the one from Rochester in 2012, the one from Essex, and the one from Queensland in 2016. That prove this. So if you know a man who is very homophobic, know that he might be hiding his homosexual tendencies. In Billy's case, Daryl changed his name to Daryl Darylin. And right in the middle of the interview, he confessed to being Billy's killer. Daryl Darylin said that she or he, at that time he was a man, and his group of homophobic friends used to beat up gay people in West Hollywood. And that he remembered seeing only Billy walking that night. He grabbed him by the neck and told him he would go with him to a vehicle or else he would hurt him, Billy. He agreed out of fear. That's when they beat him up. And then Daryl, who at that time was a man, he strangled him with a cable, and then they decided to dismember the body. Now, the strange thing about all this is that if you remember in the autopsy, it said the face was intact. There were no signs of any blows. But in Daryl's statement, or Daryl Darylin, who is now a woman, they talked about a beating, which doesn't make sense, but anyway. This was the confession that Darylyn made in prison in this documentary. Because they only had the confession, they couldn't press charges. But at least the family knew who had been Billy's killer. I still want to make things clear. I still haven't seen the documentary. Honestly, I do want to watch this documentary because I think it's a very interesting case, and I believe there's going to be a lot more information because I was left with a lot of questions. For example, what did they do with the other parts of the body? Were they found? Were they not found? What did Darylyn say? Because I didn't find this in any article. And I couldn't watch the documentary either because I think the documentary is currently making the festival rounds, so it hasn't been released yet. You can't rent it or buy it yet. And another question I have is, who were the other people involved in the murder? Because according to Darylyn, there was a group of homophobic people who used to beat others. They used to beat up gay men in West Hollywood. And I also find that really interesting because that means there are possible suspects. I think this investigation shouldn't be closed until the other suspects are found. And like I said, this is information I didn't find in the few articles that exist about the case.